Okay, this video is just a whole range of ideas, really important things that I think you need to be touching on for this area of study, and I've really just compiled them all together. So there's no constructive order, but there's a lot to take from what I'm talking about here. So as I said, you need to be aware of some current facts that are happening at the moment. So in terms of, you don't need to know a lot of percentages, but you do need to be aware of the targets we're setting for growth, unemployment and inflation. So at the moment, growth's around 2.4% as of March, which is below our target range. Unemployment is around 5.6%, again above the idea of 4 to 5 or the goal, which shows spare capacity, which shows that the labour market is still relatively weak. Not extremely weak, it's not like it's 8 or 9%, but it's still above our target range. Supply is still exceeding demand for labour, and inflation is around 1.9 to 2%, which is a sign that we're just outside that target range, or if it's at 2%, we're at the bottom of that range. So inflation is not a big issue. That's the headline rate at the moment, and the headline rate is generally the one that we will quote when we're looking at inflation. Other things to be aware of is that with the unemployment rate, it is trending downwards a little bit, although it's kind of hovered around 5.5, 5.6% this year. Employment is increasing, so the number of employed people are increasing, but that's mainly because the size of the labour force has increased. So more people are entering the labour force, creating more employment, but not really reducing unemployment because there's sort of the new people that are entering are generally finding work, but because the size of the labour force is larger, there's also an increase or no decrease in unemployment. Participation is increasing. Underemployment hovers around 8.8%, not quite as high as last year, but still relatively high. Underutilisation is around 15%. So 15% of the labour force are unable to find work or are not working as much as they would like. So that's a sign that there's significant spare capacity still, and that's why wage pressures are so low in Australia, because the supply of labour is still outweighing demand, and therefore there's limited wage growth. In terms of current factors, I'll talk about this more in the next few slides. So as I said, inflation is around 1.9% headline. In terms of factors that are leading to increased inflation, we've got the lower dollar, which is pushing more pressure on demand pull inflation, and the lower dollar is also putting more pressure on cost push inflation as well, because it will increase cost of production and it will lead to increased demand for our exports. When you're talking about the lower dollar and its impact on the goals, make sure you're not just talking about net exports. The better answers to those questions can make links to the fact that that net exports flows on to increased production. That leads to more demand for resources, and that'll all flow on to increased consumption and investment as well. So it's important to recognise that the circular flow, know your circular flow well, and explain all the components that may occur when something like the dollar depreciates. Factors, other things, interest rates are currently low, which means that's a positive, increasing demand pull inflation, but it's positive for growth. Negative things for growth, the main one is that consumer confidence has gone down slightly this year. That increases the marginal propensity to save and therefore reduce some demand pull inflationary pressures. The one decreasing cost push is that real wage growth is slow. So wages are going up slowly. If we can increase productivity faster than that, we can keep our real unit labour costs down and therefore become more internationally competitive, and firms will have lower costs of production. In terms of just confusing a couple of the demand and supply side factors, these are the ones, you need to pause on this slide to get which ones are which. These ones just affect demand. So we're talking about things that just impact the demand curve, and these factors will lead to more growth because there'll be an expansion in supply or an expansion in production to meet that demand, assuming we're not at productive capacity. So these factors here will not help to boost our growth if we're at productive capacity, because we can't supply anymore to meet that demand. Business confidence is probably the one people get confused with the most. That's a demand side factor because it boosts investment spending, creates more inflation because there's more demand for capital resources, which increases prices. It also leads to increased employment throughout the economy, which can lead to some higher prices as well. So that's the one that confuses the most people. These ones, you just need to shift the supply curve. Technological change, climatic conditions, real unit labour costs, productivity will just shift supply, and they're the ones that are going to allow for long-term sustainable growth because we can meet demand with more supply. That language is really important. Supply side factors allow us to grow because it increases firms' willingness to supply, which allows us to match demand with supply so we can experience long-term, non-inflationary, sustainable growth. And these factors here are the factors that will impact both. So the exchange rate, oil prices, interest rates, income taxes, these first three mainly impact demand. So if you're linking them to employment, a lower exchange rate, lower income tax, lower interest rates, so the three lowers, if that's what you want to call them, if you're linking them to employment, it's important to recognise that the main impact is because of increased aggregate demand. So lower income taxes, for example, yes, it might boost participation and that might create more unemployment, but overall, the lower income taxes, their main impact is on more demand. There's more demand for goods and services. More demand leads to, in the circular flow, more production, more employment. I think there's very common for people in here to be forgetting about the fact that the main impact on employment is the fact there is more demand for goods and services. All of these factors here in the demand side column, and when these ones move in the right direction as well, all lead to more demand. They either lead to more C, more I, or more X. Explain that in your answer. That then leads to more production, which then flows on to increased employment. We need more workers for the extra production. So if it's a demand side factor, it's increasing demand, it's going to lead to higher demand for workers, higher incomes, higher employment. That is critical that you go through that process when you're talking about demand side factors. Components are different to factors, so these things here are factors impacting demand. If you get asked for a factor impacting our economic growth, you can only talk about these factors. You can't talk about these. They are the components of aggregate demand. Consumption is not a factor impacting demand. Investment spending is not a factor impacting demand. They are components of demand, and it's these things that will cause demand to change, and that will impact the components, which will overall impact aggregate demand. You can't also talk about unemployment as a factor. These things are goals. They are not factors impacting demand. Do not talk about these. If you get a question about factors, you won't get any marks. You need to talk about these things, your macro demand and supply side factors, not these ones, these ones. The goals, it's more important that you know the goals off by heart. You can say right now in your exam you're probably going to be defining at least two of these in relation to some extended response question. So strong and sustainable economic growth, the fastest rate of economic growth measured by increases in real GDP. Whenever you're talking about economic growth, mention that it's an increase in real GDP. Consistent with strong employment growth, so we're employing more people, but it's not going to cause excessive inflationary, environmental or external pressures. So the problem with growing at above 3 or above 4% is that we can start to run into things like inflation, which hurts our living standards, can hurt the environment, and it can lead to more debt. Don't want to grow too low because it will cause more unemployment. Price stability or low inflation, they mean the same thing. Don't get confused if the question asks you for price stability and not low inflation. Inflation of 2 to 3% measured by headline inflation. You won't get the marks if you stop there. You need to say on average. That's important because we're allowed to go up and above and below it sometimes, but on average it has to be between 2 to 3% over the course of the business cycle. So there's three components. The over the course of the business cycle, the average bit is its own component, very important, and 2 to 3% headline when you're defining that goal. All critical parts of the definition. And last one, full employment, the lowest rate of unemployment without causing excessive inflationary or external pressures. Low unemployment without causing inflation or excessive debt. It's generally 4 to 5%, no cyclical unemployment. They all need to be in your definition. The lowest rate without causing inflation or external pressures, around 4 to 5%, no cyclical unemployment. Couple of things that I've noticed in class people struggling with a little bit. If people are staying at school longer, if we have increased school retention rates, that's likely to decrease unemployment. People that are most likely to become unemployed are people that leave school early because it's harder to get a job, you have less skills. So if people are leaving at 15 or 14, then they're going to be more likely to be unemployed, not 14 because you've got to be 15, scratch that. But if people are staying longer, more people go to university and stay there till they're 30, unemployment will go down because there's less people looking for jobs and less unemployment, particularly youth unemployment. An ageing population is bad for participation because your numerator, the amount of people looking for work or employment, goes down because people eventually retire, and therefore as a percentage of the working age population it goes down as well. There are less people in the labour force as a percentage of everyone over 15 years of age. High capacity utilisation is associated with low unemployment. Okay, it means we're close to our productive capacity. If this is our productive capacity here, it means we're working closer to that area there. We are closer to our productive capacity, and that means that we're more likely to be experiencing capacity constraints, but it's associated with low unemployment, it's associated with skill shortages. Skill shortages are associated with low unemployment. If there's skill shortages, it means we don't have enough workers. There'd be no reason why, if there's skill shortages, we also have unemployed people in that profession. They have to be pretty bad at their job if we had dramatic skill shortages and they still couldn't get a job. It means they'd be pretty hopeless at doing what they're doing. Skill shortages and low unemployment are generally synonymous with each other. Not going to go into these. I talked about these in class. If you want to pause this slide, you've got your main factors impacting employment, main factors and growth, and then the main factors impacting inflation. So if you want to pause this slide and use this or take a picture of it, you can, but I'm not going to go into it now. Relationships, again, unemployment and participation, something that people are finding difficult. When unemployment increases, participation generally goes down. People are more likely to leave the labour force and become discouraged. Therefore, participation, the percentage of people over 15 goes down that are looking for work. Make sure you define those concepts in your answer. Define participation, define unemployment in terms of getting the marks. When unemployment goes down, participation is likely to rise because people join the labour force because it's easier to get a job. People feel confident, there's less discouraged workers. As you can see, that's quite a short answer. The impact of participation on unemployment is a lot more detailed. When participation increases, unemployment may increase in the short term. There are more people looking for jobs. There is increased competition for jobs. It's like trying out for a sports team. The more people that are trying out, the harder it is to make it. If more people join, if we have high immigration, that can cause more unemployment because more people are competing for jobs. In the long term, the idea is that the increase in competition, okay, the more unemployment, the more competition. Don't say low unemployment is associated with with high competition. If you're the only one that's unemployed, you go for a job, there's not going to be many others going for that job because everyone else has got a job. Everyone else is employed at that point in time. If you're the only one that's unemployed, unemployment is low, it's easier to get a job, there is less competition. So participation increases, there's more competition. That should help to boost productivity and lower wages because there's more competition for jobs. This helps to reduce prices. And then you get to the big one, international competitiveness. A lot of questions on supply, or any question on supply, you probably eventually want to get to international competitiveness increasing. And that all helps to create jobs and reduce unemployment. Participation decreases. Unemployment may decrease in the short term due to decreased competition for jobs. In the long term, this is associated with our ageing population. We're likely to see a decrease in competition for jobs. That may decrease productivity. It may lead to higher wages. And all of that's going to decrease our international competitiveness and can potentially lead to a decrease in demand for workers and therefore more unemployment. Strong and weak labour markets. Strong labour markets, low unemployment. Okay, low unemployment, high wage pressures, the demand for workers is exceeding supply, low rates of underemployment, most people are working long hours, and there's likely to be high inflation, both demand pull and cost push. Demand pull inflation, again, this is that link that I think most people aren't quite nailing. That idea that if more people have got a job, more people have got income. Yes, living standards improve, but also demand pull inflation, because if incomes are higher, people spend more, and therefore there's likely to be more demand pull inflation. Cost push inflation goes up because wages go up. There's also rising job vacancies because businesses are looking for workers. There's high demand for work. The demand curve has shifted to the right. Weak labour markets, low wage pressures, supply is exceeding demand. There's high rates of unemployment, high rates of underemployment, so lots of spare capacity in the market. And that's likely to lead to both demand pull inflation going down because of a lack of income. If you don't have a job, you can't spend much, and reduce cost push inflation because of a lack of wage pressures. Both of those occur in a weak labour market. Thank you.